Rip out that pile of rocks. The man owes $400 and thinks he's above the community.
Heather Lynn Pemberton said it at the Cascade Meadows Estates HOA podium, with her manicured finger pointed at a wall-sized photograph of my family's 1793 gristmill dam on the Branch River. Her 84 homeowners raised their hands in a near-unanimous vote. Her husband Chadwick filmed it for her Substack. Her HOA's environmental attorney filed the removal petition with the Vermont Environmental Court the following Tuesday. My great-great-great-great-grandfather, Octave Thibodeau, had hand-hewn the first course of that dam's stone in 1793. The Army Corps surveyed it in 1954. I had recertified it as a licensed dam safety engineer for the state of Vermont 11 months earlier. Heather thought she was bringing a stubborn rural man to heel. She didn't know I was the state of Vermont's chief dam safety engineer, and that the dam her HOA had just voted to demolish was the only thing stopping the Branch River from flooding her subdivision in the spring. What would you have done? Where are you watching tonight? My name is Rowan Thibodeau. I am 54 years old. I live on 180 acres at the edge of Lincoln, Vermont, and for 28 years I served as a dam safety engineer with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, for the last 9 of those years as the state's chief dam safety engineer. I am now semi-retired, which in Vermont means I answer the phone 4 days a week, walk my own stretch of river on the 5th, and try not to think too much about the ones I lost. My great-great-great-great-grandfather, Octave Thibodeau, came down from Trois-Rivières, Quebec, in the spring of 1792 with a saw, a plow, and his wife Adelaide. They bought 160 acres on the Branch River, a tributary of the New Haven, which flows into the Champlain watershed, and they spent the first year girdling maples and building a cabin. In 1793, Octave hand-hewed the first course of stone for a dam across the branch, to power a gristmill he could sell flour from. That dam is still there. My father, Guillaume, rebuilt the eastern spillway after Hurricane Hazel in 1954. I recertified the whole structure in 2019, and again 11 months before this story began. My wife Eleanor passed 3 Februaries ago from glioblastoma, after a 9-month fight that seemed to take all of us years to recover from. She was a high school French teacher in Bristol. We'd been married 26 years. She and I would sit on the mill pond dock in the evenings and count the bats coming out of the mill loft, which was a thing she'd taught me to pay attention to one summer evening in 1999. Our daughter Marin is 24. She's a graduate student in hydrology at the University of Vermont. Her thesis, when it is finished, will be on private dam reservoir thermal dynamics in small New England watersheds. She plans to come home and run the mill and the consulting firm when I am done with them. My brother Silas passed 6 years ago. He had struggled with opioids for a long time. He left behind his daughter, my niece Willa, who is 17 now and who lives with me 3 days a week. Willa and Marin are close the way sisters who are not sisters learn to be when they share a kitchen. Downstream from the dam, 1,000 feet south of the mill, sits the subdivision called Cascade Meadows Estates. 84 timber frame homes built in 2014 by a developer out of Burlington on a piece of the old Poulin dairy farm that the last Poulin had sold to cover a bad medical bill. The subdivision fills a shallow bowl in the valley, the bowl that my family's dam and the 2 small flood control berms Silas and I had added ourselves in 2003 had been gently regulating for 221 years. The HOA president is a woman named Heather Lynn Pemberton. She is 51. She moved to Vermont with her husband Chadwick 8 years ago from Darien, Connecticut, to live authentically, which in her case meant buying the biggest house in the subdivision, wearing Carhartt jackets that still had the tags on them 6 months later, and running a Substack called Rural Renewal with 2,300 subscribers, most of whom live within 20 miles of Central Park. 3 years ago, Heather and I had our first actual conversation. She asked, at the Bristol Farmers Market, whether I'd consider sharing some of that pond with the broader community. I told her, politely, that the pond was part of a working dam, licensed under the Vermont Dam Safety Program. She told me, politely, that I needed to think less like a landowner and more like a neighbor. I told her, politely, that I was both. She has not, in the 3 years since, spoken to me politely. This past autumn she came up with a plan. The first invoice arrived in mid-October on Cascade Meadows Estates HOA letterhead. $400. Memo line. Community Infrastructure Assessment. Annual. The document cited a new HOA bylaw Heather had pushed through a special vote, creating a fee on all landowners whose property abuts or benefits from community water features, payable annually to the HOA's general fund. I am not a member of the HOA. I did not vote on the bylaw. My land does not abut any community water feature. The HOA abuts my water feature. Nothing about the demand was legally enforceable against me. I folded the invoice in half. I wrote, "Return to sender, not a member," on the envelope. I mailed it back. Heather sent a second copy in November with a handwritten note. "Rowan, I encourage you to be a good neighbor and pay this. Don't make me escalate." I mailed that one back too, with the same annotation, and I took a photograph from my files before I sealed it, which turned out to be the first photograph in what eventually became a very thick case file. In December, she filed in small claims court for $400, plus administrative fees, plus interest at 18%, for a total demand of $1,847. I answered with a one-page response, citing Vermont common law, and pointing out that an HOA cannot unilaterally assess fees on non-members. The judge, a 68-year-old former private practice attorney named Abner Gladstone, who had farmed 5 acres of his own on weekends for 40 years, dismissed the case from the bench in 4 minutes. In late January, the real attack arrived. Heather and her husband Chadwick retained a Burlington environmental law firm, Hardaway, Vincent, and Strong, for what I later learned was a $12,000 initial retainer. Hardaway Vincent filed a petition in the Vermont Environmental Court, alleging that my family's dam was 1. A private speculation that unlawfully impounded public waters of the state of Vermont, in violation of the public trust doctrine. 2. A pollution source, due to unspecified sediment accumulation in the reservoir. 3. A public nuisance, creating a flood risk to downstream residents. 4. An unpermitted structure, subject to mandatory removal under Vermont statute. Every one of those 4 claims was false. I knew it because I had, literally, administered the state statutes under which each claim would be adjudicated, for most of my professional career. The dam is a properly permitted impoundment under 10 VSA Chapter 43. It has current certification through 2029. Its last sediment quality test was in 2022 and passed every threshold. Its current flood control contribution was documented in a 2017 state hydrology study I had co-authored. I read the filing twice in my kitchen. I called my attorney, a 71-year-old man named Elias Gagnon from Middlebury, who had represented my father in a boundary dispute in 1987. Elias read the filing over the phone while I poured myself a second cup of coffee. "Rowan, they have sued you in an environmental court with a filing that would be dismissed on a motion to strike in any other division. Do you know who their engineering consultant is?" "I do not." Says here his name is Gideon Wainwright. Ring a bell? Gideon Wainwright took the engineering ethics course I taught at UVM in 2009 and received a B- after I caught him misattributing 2 equations in his final project. "Oh, Rowan." "Elias, she does not know who I am." A long, dry silence. "Son, let's file." A knowledge nugget worth saving. In most states, including Vermont, a private dam built before modern permitting regimes is generally grandfathered under state law if it has been continuously maintained and periodically certified. If somebody files a public nuisance claim against an established private dam, their burden of proof is very high, and documented certification history is your best defense. I spent the next 2 weeks pulling files. The 1793 original mill dam construction log in Octave Thibodeau's own hand, which I keep in an acid-free folder in my father's gun safe. The 1954 Army Corps of Engineers Reinforcement Survey. The 1991 Vermont Dam Safety Program Initial Full Certification. The 2017 State Flood Mitigation Study. The 2019 recertification. The 2024 recertification. Photographs, drone surveys, sediment test results for every year from 1998 through 2023. I also pulled, at Elias's suggestion, the property records for the Cascade Meadows Estates lots. And I pulled, at my own suggestion, the Vermont Secretary of State's business filings for an LLC named Meadow Cascade Development Group, which had been quietly registered 8 months earlier. The sole 2 members of Meadow Cascade Development Group were Chadwick Pemberton and a Burlington real estate broker named Tamsin Ellery. I sat back in my kitchen chair. I looked out my window at the gristmill in the blue, late January light. Then I called Marin, who was studying at UVM, and I asked her to come home that weekend with her laptop. Marin arrived Saturday at 10. She hugged me at the front door. She set her laptop on the kitchen table. She took her coffee black, the way her mother did. Dad, what am I looking at? I laid out the HOA petition. I laid out the Meadow Cascade Development Group filing. I laid out my 2017 flood mitigation study. I laid out the satellite imagery of Cascade Meadows estates and the topographic contours showing the floodplain. Marin studied it for 18 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up. Dad, if the dam comes out in late February or March, tell me what you see. Branch River averages a 200% flow increase during snowmelt. The dam currently absorbs about 65% of peak discharge. If it's removed, peak discharge moves downstream intact, plus about 1,000 acre-feet of stored reservoir volume that hasn't been released slowly. The bowl below Cascade Meadows fills first. Then the homes on the lower 17 lots flood. Then the homes on the middle 31 lots. If there's a concurrent precipitation event on already saturated ground, the whole subdivision, how long would it take to unfold? 12 to 36 hours, depending on weather. Dad, she knows this, right? Her lawyer knows this? Her engineer knows this? Her engineer is Gideon Wainwright. Marin closed her laptop. Oh, Dad, she has no idea. I looked at my daughter for a long, quiet moment across the table, where her mother had taught her to read at 4. Marin, let's make sure she has every chance to have an idea. Over the next 3 weeks, I prepared, with Elias Gagnon's help, the most thorough response filing I have ever authored in my career. 283 pages, indexed, referenced, hydrologically modeled in 3 separate scenarios at 10-year, 50-year, and 100-year flood intervals. I attached certified copies of every state permit. I attached the 1793 construction log, translated from French into English by a Middlebury College professor who did the work for free because his grandmother had bought flour from my grandfather in 1952. I attached the 2017 state flood mitigation study and underlined the section that specifically cited the Thibodaux Mill Dam as a critical flood control structure, preserving floodplain stability for downstream residential development. I attached a separate affidavit identifying the Meadow Cascade Development Group, its 2 members, and the 9 quiet filings Chadwick Pemberton had made with the Addison County Regional Planning Commission, inquiring about potential residential subdivision of approximately 6 acres of drained reservoir bedland should a restoration opportunity arise. I titled that exhibit simply, Petitioner's Undisclosed Financial Interest. Hardaway, Vincent, and Strong responded with a 6-page brief dismissing my submission as expert overreach by a biased, self-interested landowner. They attached a single-page counter-affidavit from Gideon Wainwright asserting, without hydrological modeling, that the Thibodaux Dam's contribution to downstream flood mitigation is likely minimal under modern climate conditions. Marin, when I showed her Gideon's affidavit, laughed once. Then she looked embarrassed. Then she wrote, under the laugh, in her neat graduate student's hand, a single line on the margin of her own printout. He did not even use the word peak discharge. The takeaway worth saving. A proper flood hydrology assessment always models peak discharge at multiple return intervals. If somebody offers you a flood analysis that does not use those 2 words, ask what course they skipped in school. The answer will be instructive. In early March, the Vermont Environmental Court set a hearing. Judge Millicent Crowe, a 64-year-old jurist who had spent 21 years on the bench and who had presided, I remembered with no small concern, over a widely criticized 2011 ruling in which she had ordered the removal of a different historic dam that had subsequently caused $4 million in downstream damage. Elias Gagnon, when he saw her name on the docket, removed his reading glasses and said, very carefully, Rowan, we will make our record thoroughly, and we will prepare to appeal. The hearing was set for March 27th. The snow on Mount Ellen that year was already at 112% of normal. The hearing ran 5 hours. Heather Lynn Pemberton sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy blazer, a cream blouse, and a pearl necklace. Chadwick sat behind her. Their lead attorney, a 57-year-old man named Cyprian Hardaway, walked Judge Crowe through a theory of the case that treated my family's dam as an inconvenience rather than an engineered structure. He argued the public trust doctrine. He argued the common waters doctrine. He argued visual aesthetics. He argued, with a straight face, that the dam was preventing the HOA's residents from experiencing their river. Gideon Wainwright testified for 40 minutes. He was 38 years old, soft-handed, and had, by my count, 3 factual errors about Vermont dam permitting in his first 10 minutes. He asserted that the Thibodaux Dam's flood control function was anecdotal. He asserted that my 2017 study was outdated. He asserted that the reservoir behind the dam represented roughly 11 million gallons of privately hoarded public water. Marin sat in the third row behind me. Willa sat beside her. Elias Gagnon conducted his cross-examination of Gideon Wainwright in 18 minutes. By minute 14, Gideon had admitted, under oath, that he had not modeled peak discharge at any return interval, that he had not reviewed the 1954 Army Corps survey, that he had not physically visited the dam site, and that he had completed his engineering certification at a program I had helped redesign in 2011, but whose final dam safety module he had been exempted from for scheduling reasons. Judge Crow, watching, did not say anything. Her face did not move. Then Elias put me on the stand. For 2 hours I walked through the dam's history, its permitting status, its flood control function, and the 3-scenario hydrological model Marin and I had built. I answered every question Cyprian Hardaway asked. At the end of my testimony, I did something I had never done before in a courtroom in 28 years. I looked Judge Crow in the eye and I said, "Your Honor, with respect, I am the state of Vermont's recent chief dam safety engineer. I have inspected 812 Vermont dams in my career. I am telling you, as clearly as I know how to say anything, that removing this dam in the spring runoff season will cause a catastrophic flood of Cascade Meadows estates within 30 days of removal. The 100-year flood scenario I have submitted is conservative. The 84 families downstream are, as we speak, living inside a structure I have kept dry for 28 years." The room was silent. Cyprian Hardaway objected on grounds of inflammatory rhetoric. Judge Crow overruled him. She took the matter under advisement. 11 days later, she issued her written order, a knowledge nugget worth saving. Vermont environmental courts, like most state environmental tribunals, operate on the presumption that a properly permitted structure carries a rebuttable legal status. If a petitioner attacks such a structure, they bear the burden of proof. A good judge reads the burden carefully. A bad judge does not. Judge Crow's order was a compromise ruling. She acknowledged the historic status of the dam. She acknowledged my professional credentials. She also, however, accepted Hardaway's argument that Vermont's evolving environmental law required reconsideration of grandfathered structures in modern flood risk contexts. She ordered, as a modified resolution, that I could retain the dam on the condition of paying a modified fee of $1,200 to the HOA's legal costs and completing a full environmental impact review within 60 days, at my own expense, to be reviewed by a court-appointed neutral expert panel. Failure to comply in either respect would result in a removal order. I paid the $1,200 that afternoon. I wrote "under protest" on the memo line. Elias photographed the check. I then commissioned the environmental impact review. I completed it myself because the state's 2 most qualified neutral experts were both on vacation for the next 4 weeks, and because I was the 3rd most qualified person in the state of Vermont, and I was, legitimately, the fastest. 283 pages, expanded to 341. Marin co-authored the hydrological section. A colleague at UVM, a wetlands ecologist named Dr. Imogen Fletcher, contributed an independent habitat analysis. I submitted the document, formally, on day 56 of the 60-day window. Hardaway, Vincent, and Strong rejected it. They rejected it on the grounds that I had written it myself. They argued, in a sharply worded motion, that my review was inherently biased by the author's ownership interest and could not be accepted by the court. They paid $18,000 in additional legal fees to file that motion. Judge Crow granted it. On May 4th, she issued the order I had warned against: removal of the Thibodaux Mill Dam at my own expense within 90 days. That night I sat at the kitchen table with Marin, Willa, Elias Gagnon, and my 78-year-old neighbor, Amos Bouchard, who had known my father for 51 years and who had, without being asked, driven over with a casserole and a bottle of good Canadian rye. Elias laid out the appeal options. A motion to reconsider would take 3 months. A direct appeal to the Vermont Supreme Court would take 9 to 14 months. Neither timeline would save the dam before the late spring snowmelt, which Marin's climatology data suggested would peak in mid-May, sooner than Judge Crow had contemplated in her 90-day removal window. Dad, Marin's voice was carefully steady. What is our actual option? We comply with the court order, which means the dam comes down. In 90 days or less, which means it will be down just after peak flow. And then the valley floods. Willa, who had been listening without speaking, set her fork down carefully. Uncle Rowan. Yeah, kid. Are you going to let it happen? I looked at my 17-year-old niece, at Marin, at Amos, at Elias, at my late wife's ceramic salt cellar that sat in the center of the table, exactly where Eleanor had set it 3 Februaries ago. Willa, here is what I am going to do. I am going to file every motion Elias can draft, in every venue that has jurisdiction, warning every party to this proceeding that the dam's removal will cause a catastrophic downstream flood. I am going to put my warning on the record at the Vermont Environmental Court, the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, the Addison County Emergency Management Office, the Lincoln Town Select Board, and the Cascade Meadows Estates HOA Board itself, in writing, with certified mail return receipts. I am going to testify, under oath, at a public hearing, with my daughter's hydrological model projected on a screen, that 84 families are in the direct path of a flood the court is ordering me to cause. And then I am going to comply with the court order. Elias closed his eyes. He nodded once. Amos poured us each another finger of rye. Marin said quietly, Dad, is there any chance she changes her mind? No, honey. She is going to sue me on day 91 for being 1 day late, and then claim she was the one who forced the dam's removal. So what's the thing that turns this around? I thought about it for a long moment. The Branch River is the thing that turns this around. A takeaway worth pinning. Every engineer learns, in the 3rd year of the curriculum, that you cannot argue with water. You can guide it. You can resist it for a while. You cannot persuade it. When a court orders you to remove a flood control structure against a professional engineer's explicit testimony, the court has issued an order the river itself will eventually ignore. Amos Bouchard, at 78, set his glass down on the table. He looked at me. His eyes had the calm of a man who had lived through Hurricane Hazel in 1954, as a 7-year-old boy hanging onto his father's sleeve. Rowan. Yeah, Amos. Your grandfather built that dam. Your father saved it. You kept it alive. What she's going to do with it is on her. I hear you, Amos. And when she calls you, afterward, to come rebuild it. He paused. You answer the phone. I did not trust my voice. I nodded. Outside, in the dark, the Branch River ran over the dam's spillway the way it had every spring since 1793. Over the following 90 days, I did what engineers do when they cannot win and will not panic. I documented. I filed formal, written warnings of the anticipated downstream flood with every entity that had jurisdictional interest in the valley. The Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, the Addison County Emergency Management Office, the Lincoln Town Select Board, the Vermont Emergency Management Division, the Federal Emergency Management Agency Region 1 office in Boston. Each letter included my 283-page environmental assessment, Marin's hydrological model at 3 return intervals, and a plain language summary letter written for non-engineers. Each was sent by certified mail, return receipt requested, with copies to my attorney and to the Cascade Meadows Estates HOA board itself. I received in return 17 form letters acknowledging receipt and 1 personal letter from Ingrid Norsworthy, the current deputy commissioner at the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, who had been my colleague for 14 years and who wrote in her own hand. Rowan, I have flagged the file internally. When this breaks, we will move fast. Take care of your family. I hired a licensed dam removal contractor out of Rutland, a 39-year-old engineer named Stellan Brink, who had removed 14 Vermont dams in the past decade under proper environmental protocols, and who, after reading my environmental assessment, refused to quote me a price until he had reviewed the flood risk memos I had filed. When he finished reading them, he took off his reading glasses, set them on my kitchen table, and said, Mr. Thibodeau, with respect, sir, I would like to go on record with you that in my professional opinion, your dam should not be coming down in spring. I know, Stellan. I am still going to do the job, but I would like to be part of the record you are building. Thank you, son. He signed a sworn affidavit at my kitchen table that afternoon, describing the structure as sound, describing the court order as unfounded in engineering practice, and joining my formal warnings to the state. Marin and I spent 6 weekends, through April and early May, physically preparing for the removal. Stellenbrink's crew excavated channels, set erosion control fabric, established sediment traps, and installed 3 new acoustic monitoring sensors that would capture discharge data in real time. Every operation was photographed, time-stamped, and cross-referenced to a master log. A takeaway worth pinning. If you are ever forced by court order to undertake an engineering action you know will cause downstream harm, the best thing you can do is generate a contemporaneous record with third-party professional verification that establishes the engineering community's objection. That record will be worth more to your attorneys, your insurance carriers, and any future litigation than any amount of warning letters alone. I wrote a personal letter to Heather Lynn Pemberton, 3 pages, handwritten, in ink, not as a legal document, but as one neighbor to another. I laid out, in plain language, what her dam removal petition would cause. I included the flood risk maps. I offered, for the final time, to withdraw my planned compliance with the court order if she would agree to withdraw her petition and accept an ordinary neighbor easement. I mailed it with delivery confirmation. She posted it on her Substack with a 1,500-word ridicule. 72 subscribers canceled that week. The morning of Stellen's first excavation day, Marin, Willa, Amos Bouchard, and I stood on the mill pond dock. The water was perfectly still. A red-tailed hawk was circling the spillway. Marin had a travel mug of coffee. Willa had her father Silas's old wool cap pulled down over her ears, even though it was 52 degrees. Dad. Yeah, Marin. Grandpa would have known exactly what to say right now. He would have said, "Start the machine, boy. The job is the job." Yeah, that's about right. Stellenbrink walked up from his pickup with his helmet and clipboard. He did not smile. He nodded to me. I nodded back. He signaled his excavator operator. At 9:13 a.m. on Wednesday, May 14th, in the 332nd year of my family's tenure on the Branch River, the first scoop of stone came out of the Thibodeau Mill Dam. The dam came down over 7 working days. Stellenbrink's crew worked with the discipline of professionals who knew, without needing to be told, that they were participants in something they would remember. They removed the structure in careful stages, slowed the reservoir drawdown to reduce downstream shock, salvaged every original 1793 stone, per my specific instructions, for future potential restoration. Each stone was numbered with weatherproof paint, photographed, and set aside on a tarp on higher ground above the old mill. By day 7, at 4 in the afternoon, the Branch River ran through its original 1792 channel for the first time in 232 years. The 11 million-gallon reservoir was gone. The dock where Eleanor and I had counted bats was standing 4 feet in the air above dried black mud. Heather Lynn Pemberton held a celebration at the Cascade Meadows Estates clubhouse that Friday evening. She called it a river liberation ceremony. The invitation graphic, which she posted on her Substack, featured a cartoon beaver wearing a crown. 43 of her 84 residents attended. Chadwick passed out wine. Gideon Wainwright gave a 7-minute speech about restoring public waters to public use. Heather read, from a printed sheet, the names of the 407 Substack subscribers who had contributed to the HOA's legal fund over the past year. She did not mention my letter. She did not mention my environmental assessment. She did not mention the 3-scenario flood model my daughter had run. She did not mention the fact that, at that precise moment, the snowpack on Mount Ellen and Sugarbush was melting at the fastest rate in 11 years. I was not at the ceremony. I was at home. I was preparing. Marin had driven home from Burlington Thursday evening with a duffel bag. Willa had moved her overnight things into the spare bedroom. I had stockpiled 3 weeks of food and water at the top of the Hill House, our oldest structure, built in 1798, sitting 54 feet above the river valley on a solid granite ledge. I had moved the tractors, the consulting office server, the milled lumber inventory, and the 1954 Army Corps survey rolls to high ground. I had notified my insurance carrier, who had attached my letter to the company's internal flood risk flag for the Branch River watershed. I had, at Elias Gagnon's insistence, executed a notarized statement of contemporaneous record, acknowledging that I had fully complied with the court's removal order. That night, the weather began. A warm front came up from the mid-Atlantic. Temperatures climbed from 40 to 58 overnight in the valley. Rain started at 11:23 p.m., steady, heavy, sustained. By 3 a.m., the Sugarbush weather station was reporting 2 inches in 4 hours on existing snowpack. By 6 a.m., it was 3.5 inches and counting. The Branch River, which had been running at 800 cubic feet per second the day the dam came down, began climbing. By 8 a.m., the river was at 2,300 cubic feet per second. By noon, 4,800. By 4 in the afternoon, 7,100, with the rain still coming. I sat in the hill house with Marin, Willa, and Amos Bouchard, whom I had invited over that morning. We watched Marin's real-time monitoring laptop. The acoustic sensors Stellan Brink's crew had installed in the former reservoir bed were registering the flow. At 4:43 p.m., the Branch River overtopped its banks, where the old mill pond used to be. At 5:51 p.m., the flood wave reached the northern edge of Cascade Meadows Estates. At 6:08 p.m., my landline rang. I picked it up on the second ring. Rowan. Heather. Rowan. We need help. A knowledge nugget worth saving. When a preventable disaster unfolds despite clear, documented, repeated, and professionally sworn warnings, the person who caused it by ignoring those warnings is morally responsible. The engineering community has a phrase for this: the river does not vote. That phrase is, when you hear it for the first time, shocking. It is meant to be. I looked at Marin. Marin looked at me. Heather, where are you right now? Our basement. My husband, Chadwick, is. The water is coming up the basement stairs. We've called 911, but they're saying the road is underwater. How deep is the water in your basement, Heather? 4 feet, maybe 5. I don't. Get to your second floor. Get anything flammable away from the electrical panel. Unplug everything you can. Do you have food and water upstairs? Yes. Some. Good. Ration. A rescue boat is going to come when it can. Do not try to drive. Rowan, please. I am hanging up now, Heather, because other people in your subdivision are going to need phone lines, and the cell towers are about to go down. I will see you on the other side. I hung up. I set the receiver down. Marin was crying quietly. Willa was not crying. Willa was taking notes in a spiral-bound notebook. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen window. The rain was still coming. The sky over the valley was the color of old zinc. Amos Bouchard put his hand on my shoulder. Rowan, you did everything you could do. I know, Amos. Now the river does what rivers do. I know. By 9 p.m. Wednesday, the Lincoln Volunteer Fire Department, the Addison County Sheriff's Department dive team, the Vermont National Guard, and 2 boat crews from the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum were working Cascade Meadows Estates. 47 homes had water in the first floor. 2 homes, both on the lowest lots at the bend where the old Poulin barn used to stand, had floated partly off their foundations. The elementary school bus route had been suspended. 3 septic systems had failed. The ball field where Willa had once pitched a no-hitter for the Lincoln Little League was 9 feet under. By midnight, every HOA resident had been evacuated. No one died. That, in the end, was the thing. Marin, Willa, Amos, and I sat up until 3 a.m. watching the flood on the porch. We made coffee and reheated a casserole. We did not say much. Amos told one story about Hurricane Hazel and a cow his father had lost. Willa asked whether we were responsible. Marin said, no, but we're going to show up anyway. I agreed. The next morning, I drove the hill road down to the edge of the flood water. Stellan Brink was already there with his excavator and 2 John boats. The Vermont National Guard captain, a woman named Sergeant Major Rosa Kovac, met me at the roadblock. She knew me. I had given her a workshop on flood control structures in 2018. Mr. Thibodeau, Sergeant Major, I read your letter to ANR 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry I was right, Rosa. We all are, sir. What can I put you to work on? I spent the next 11 days with her crew. Rescue first, damage assessment second, sediment removal third, structural safety checks fourth. Marin worked the hydrology. Willa manned the ham radio. Amos drove his tractor through flooded streets, pulling displaced homeowners on a flatbed back and forth to the community center. Heather Lynn Pemberton was rescued from her second-floor bedroom on Thursday at 9:17 a.m. by a National Guard boat crew. Chadwick was rescued from their garage rafter, where he had climbed during a panicked attempt to save his 2 classic motorcycles, 90 minutes later. They were both taken, along with their neighbors, to the Lincoln Community Center, where my niece Willa, 17 years old, in a borrowed Red Cross vest, handed Heather a paper cup of hot coffee, without saying anything, and without meeting her eyes. Heather did not speak to me that week. Chadwick did. On day 4, when the water had receded enough to begin walking the interior of the subdivision, he walked up to me at a coffee table at the community center where Marin and I were reviewing a satellite damage map. He had not shaved in 3 days. His hair was matted. He was wearing a borrowed Bristol Fire Department t-shirt. Rowan. Chadwick. He held out a piece of paper. It was a printout of a press release he had apparently just received on his phone. The Vermont Attorney General had opened a formal investigation into Meadow Cascade Development Group, LLC, for possible fraud in connection with environmental litigation, financed in apparent anticipation of undisclosed real estate development. Rowan, my wife, I want you to know, I told her this was... Chadwick, go sit with your wife. Take care of her. We'll figure out what comes next later. He looked at me for a long moment. He nodded. He walked back to the folding chair where Heather was sitting with a Red Cross blanket around her shoulders. A knowledge nugget worth pinning. In every state, filing environmental litigation while concealing an undisclosed direct financial interest in the outcome is a form of actionable fraud. If you suspect somebody is suing your private infrastructure for speculative development purposes, file a discovery demand for their business interests within the target zone. The truth will usually be in the Secretary of State's LLC registry. On day 11, the Vermont governor's office called me personally. The governor, a Republican moderate named Bryce Wilkerson, whom I had briefed 4 times on flood infrastructure during my tenure, had seen the satellite imagery and the preliminary damage assessment. He asked me one question. Rowan, can this dam be rebuilt, and can you lead the project? I thought about it for about 9 seconds. I looked at Marin, who was across the room talking to a FEMA engineer. I looked at Willa, who was sorting donation boxes of canned soup. I looked at Amos Bouchard, who was sipping coffee and watching me from the doorway. Governor, yes, to both questions. Good. I'll have the Agency of Natural Resources on your porch tomorrow morning. Yes, sir. That night, for the first time in 11 days, I slept 7 hours. The public community meeting was held 10 days later at the Lincoln Community Center. 211 people attended. Every Cascade Meadows Estates household was represented. The governor sent his Secretary of Natural Resources, Philippa Thackeray. Judge Millicent Crowe, who had ordered the removal, attended in a personal capacity and sat, quietly, in the 3rd row. Sergeant Major Rosa Kovac was there in uniform. Ingrid Norsworthy from ANR sat at the front with her staff engineers. A documentary crew from Vermont Public was filming. I did not organize the meeting. The new interim HOA president, Heather Lynn Pemberton, had resigned 4 days earlier, was a 66-year-old retired school teacher named Harriet Goodwin. She organized it, with the help of the Lincoln Town Select Board. Harriet opened the meeting at 7 p.m. She read a brief statement of facts: the flood, the damages, the homes, the investigations, the resignation of HOA President Heather Lynn Pemberton, the dissolution of Meadow Cascade Development Group, LLC, by court order 3 days earlier, the pending fraud charges against Chadwick Pemberton and his business partner, the 15 current residents who had signed a class action civil filing against the previous HOA board for reckless endangerment. Then she invited me to the microphone. I walked up in my father's denim jacket. Marin sat in the 2nd row with Willa. Amos sat behind them. Stellan Brink, the excavator contractor, sat next to Amos. I did not raise my voice. Evening, neighbors. My name is Rowan Thibodeau. For many of you, this is the first time you've heard me speak more than 2 sentences in a row. I'd like to tell you what I'd like to do, if you will allow me. I paused. I would like to rebuild the Thibodeau Mill Dam, not as my private dam, as a publicly managed flood control structure, owned by a new regional trust composed of the town of Lincoln, the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, the Cascade Meadows Estates HOA, and my family. I would like the rebuild to be federally funded through FEMA's Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program, which the Governor and the Secretary of Natural Resources have confirmed is available. I would like the construction to be led by my firm, at cost, with no profit margin, using the original 1,793 stones my contractor's crew salvaged during the removal, supplemented by modern engineered core fill. My daughter Marin will design the hydrological model at her own time as part of her graduate work. The new structure will be certified to the 100-year flood standard and renamed, at the HOA's request, after anybody but me. I propose we name it the Branch River Community Flood Control Dam. I have a draft operating agreement here for public comment. Thank you. The room was silent for about 12 seconds. Then Harriet Goodwin walked to the microphone beside me. She put her hand on my shoulder. She turned to the room. All in favor of accepting Mr. Thibodeau's proposal, please raise your hand. 207 hands went up. The 4 that did not belong to former HOA officials, 2 of whom were under active investigation, and none of whom would, I was later told, remain in the valley past October. Then Judge Millicent Crowe stood up in the 3rd row. Mr. Thibodeau, if I may, Your Honor, I issued the order that caused this. I am prepared, tonight, in public, to apologize to you and to this community for failing to give proper weight to your professional testimony. I am also prepared to recuse myself from any further matters involving this valley, for as long as I sit on the bench. Thank you. I nodded. I could not at that moment say anything. Marin, in the 2nd row, was holding Willa's hand. Harriet Goodwin closed the meeting with a short announcement. The Cascade Meadows Estates HOA would reorganize as a nonprofit community association, with new bylaws effective October 1st. The old $400 community infrastructure fee was formally rescinded, with apologies to everyone who had been wrongly assessed. And the HOA would contribute $200,000 as a lead-matching donation to the new flood control dam project. I walked out at 9:30 with Marin under one arm and Willa under the other. Amos held the door. The Branch River, that night, was running at its normal spring level under the open sky. The rebuild took 14 months. FEMA's Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant Program funded $4.2 million of the work. The Cascade Meadows Estates HOA, renamed, at Harriet Goodwin's suggestion, the Cascade Meadows Community Association, contributed $200,000. The town of Lincoln contributed $80,000. My family contributed the 1,793 stones, the original mill site easement for the spillway, and my time at cost. Stellan Brink returned with his crew as the construction contractor. Marin designed the hydrological model as her published graduate thesis. The new dam is 11 feet taller than the original. It is faced with the 18th century cut stone my family laid by hand, and my contractor's crew salvaged during the removal. Its interior core is modern engineered earthfill, reinforced with geosynthetic clay liner. It is certified to the 150-year flood standard, with a margin built in for projected climate change precipitation patterns through 2080. It is called the Branch River Community Flood Control Dam. Beside the spillway, on a small granite boulder we rolled up from Amos Bouchard's back pasture, there is a bronze plaque the size of a dinner plate. It reads, "This dam has served the Branch River Valley since 1793, rebuilt in 2027 by the people who learned why it mattered, dedicated to the 84 households who came home." Heather Lynn Pemberton did not attend the dedication ceremony. By then, she and Chadwick had moved to Columbia, South Carolina. Chadwick had pleaded out to a felony fraud charge with 3 years of supervised probation and disgorgement of his planning commission inquiries. Heather's Substack had been dormant for 8 months. I am told, by people who keep track of such things, that she has picked up volunteer work with a local historical society, which would be, if true, a more decent landing than she might have had. The dedication ceremony was held on a warm Saturday in September. 400 people came. The governor spoke for 4 minutes. Harriet Goodwin spoke for 3. Judge Millicent Crowe read, with the judge's permission, a short statement she had written herself. Marin presented the final hydrological model on a projector screen. Willa, who had turned 18 and started at UVM on an environmental engineering scholarship the previous week, operated the projector. At the very end, Amos Bouchard, 79 now, walked up to the podium in his good jacket and said, in the quiet, careful voice he uses when he is afraid he might cry, "Rowan's father, Guillaume Thibodeau, saved this dam from Hurricane Hazel in 1954, when I was 7 years old. Rowan's great-great-great-great-grandfather, Octave Thibodeau, built it with his hands. Rowan kept it for all of us for 28 years of his professional life. I would like us all to stand and clap once, not for applause, but to say thank you to a family that has taken care of the Branch River for 234 years. 400 people stood. We clapped once. I do not remember much of what I said into the microphone after that. I remember looking at Marin. I remember Willa operating the projector. I remember Amos Bouchard back at his seat, closing his eyes for a second. In the fall, we sold the mill. Or rather, we donated it. The Cascade Meadows Community Association took title to the mill building under a 99-year lease that dedicates it as a free public museum of Branch River Valley history. Marin and I teach a Saturday workshop there, once a month, on hydrology for kids. Willa runs the exhibit on the 2027 rebuild. Heather's former HOA board meets there, under new leadership, on the second Tuesday evening of each month. I kept the 180 acres. I kept the mill pond. I kept the dock where Eleanor and I used to count bats. On the anniversary of the flood, I walked down to that dock at dusk, and I watched the bats come out of the mill loft. My late wife's old salt cellar sits on the porch railing, and I tell her the river is fine. If this story has a lesson, it is that the person who is most certain she understands a rural neighbor is usually the person who has understood the least. If your family has a piece of infrastructure that somebody smarter than you built 300 years ago, honor it. And if you have an HOA story of your own worth telling, share it in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe for next week's, where a coastal HOA decides a retired marine biologist's oyster lease belongs to the community, and learns what eelgrass law looks like in the First Circuit Court of Appeals. See you there.
What made Heather Lynn Pemberton lose wasn't the flood itself. It was her certainty that she understood a valley she had lived in for 8 years better than the people who had lived in it for 230. She mistook a quiet widower for a stubborn neighbor. She mistook a working engineer for a happy landowner. She mistook 234 years of stewardship for $400 worth of inconvenience. She never once asked, before she weaponized a court order, what the infrastructure actually did. Rower's real advantage wasn't his engineering credential. It was his refusal to make the valley pay twice. He could have said, "I told you so." He did not. He answered the phone when her husband was still on the garage rafter. And 24 hours later, he has cooling neighbors or balconies with the National Guard. 14 months later, he led the rebuild. If your family has kept a piece of infrastructure safe for generations, do not assume everyone understands why. Drop your own HOA story in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe for next week, where a coastal HOA decides a retired marine biologist author lease belongs to the community, and learns what eelgrass law looks like in federal court. See you there.